At the age of 86, Patrick Stewart is not only an actor, but a living monument of the performing arts. A man who has spent more than half a century building a career that very few people can reach. From the days standing on the stage of the Royal Shakespeare Company to when he became a global face through the role of Jean-Luc Picard in Star Trek, The Next Generation, he redefined the image of a leader on screen with intelligence, calmness, and inner depth. Continued to leave a strong mark with the role of Professor Charles Xavier in the X-Men film series, where he brought a figure that was both majestic and humane. And throughout that journey, he received countless nominations and prestigious awards, including many Emmy nominations, Golden Globe, along with recognition by a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. But perhaps the most important milestone is when he was knighted in 2010, an acknowledgement not only for his talent, but also for his enduring contributions to the arts and society, turning him into one of the most respected figures of Britain and the whole world, a symbol that the public trusts as if he is always steadfast and never wavers before anything. But behind all those achievements is not a smooth path, but a life built on deep cracks from very early on, when he grew up in a family where fear was present every day, when his father's angry voice became a familiar sound, and the mother he loved was the person he could not protect. That feeling of helplessness did not disappear over time, but quietly followed him throughout his life, making him learn to suppress emotions, learn to stay silent to survive. And even when he reached the peak of fame, those wounds still did not disappear. They were just hidden better behind the calmness that the whole world admires. He went through long years of not being recognized, broken relationships, unfillable distances with family, and the constant fear that one day he might become the very person he once feared the most. But instead of collapsing, he chose to keep moving forward, chose to turn silence into strength, turn pain into discipline, and turn the past into motivation to never stop, to become a person who is not perfect but strong enough to continue existing. Before moving on, please hit subscribe and leave a small symbol. That is how you acknowledge a man who learned to stay silent to survive through the years no one saw. And if this story makes you pause for a second to think, please stay until the end. Because behind that calmness are things even more painful that you have never known. But to understand why a man can control his emotions to the point that almost no one sees the vibration inside, we need to go back to the very first years, where everything began not with stage lights, but with the darkness of a small house in the north of England, where Patrick Stewart grew up in long nights where silence was never peaceful. Because in that house, silence was only a short break before the anger erupted. And for a child, there was nothing more terrifying than knowing that at any moment, a small sound could become the beginning of a storm. There were nights when Patrick lay in bed, eyes wide open in the darkness, listening to every step of his father moving in the house, every smallest sound becoming louder than usual, the sound of a chair being pulled, the sound of a door closing, the heavy breathing, all blending into a rhythm that the boy had learned to remember like a survival instinct. Because just by listening he knew what was about to happen, knew when to stay silent, when to keep himself still, when to pray that everything would end faster. His father, a man carrying war wounds that were never healed, was not always a scary person. But that was exactly what made everything more unpredictable, because young Patrick never knew when silence would turn into anger, when a normal sentence would become an excuse for an outburst. And when that happened, the whole house seemed to shrink into a cramped space of fear, where the mother, the woman he loved the most, became the center of all the pain. He not only saw it, he heard it, felt it, and those memories never faded over time, because they were not isolated events, but nights that repeated over and over, where each time like that etched another crack deeper into the mind of a child. There were times when Patrick stood at the end of the hallway, looking toward the room where everything was happening, his legs as if nailed to the floor, his heart beating so hard that he could hear his own heartbeat, and in that moment, He knew what he wanted to do, wanted to run in, wanted to stop it, wanted to protect his mother. But his body did not move, not because he did not want to, but because he could not. Because fear was greater than everything, and that very helplessness was the most painful thing. Because nothing hurts a child more than realizing that his love is not enough to change anything. And then there was one night, a night that later he could not forget, not because it was different, but because it was exactly like the other nights. But for the first time, Patrick understood that this was not something that would disappear, not a phase, not something that would end on its own, but a part of life that he would have to live with, a reality that he could not fix. And in that moment, something inside him changed. Not that courage appeared, but the acceptance that he could not protect the person he loved. And from then on, he learned to do the only thing he could do, which was to stay silent, observe, and survive. The fear did not disappear the next morning. It did not dissolve with the light, but stayed, seeped into every thought, every reaction, became part of the way he saw the world. And over the years, it no longer manifested in sleepless nights or clear moments of panic, but transformed into a more subtle form, a constant vigilance, a need to control everything around to avoid repeating what had happened. And even when he grew up, left that house, stepped out into the world, those nights still did not leave. They followed him into every role, every relationship, every decision, like a shadow that never disappeared, reminding that there are fears that do not need to be present, but are still enough to shape an entire life. Those nights did not end when he left that house. They only changed form, became something invisible but persistent, following Patrick Stewart into every stage of his life. And gradually, his greatest fear was no longer his father with sudden anger, but a silent, persistent, and much more terrifying thought that one day he himself would become a person like him, that everything he witnessed was not just memories, but a map being drawn in advance for his own future. And that made Patrick not only fearful, but also wary of himself in a way that no child should have to experience. He began to notice every small reaction of his own, every fleeting irritation, every moment when emotions rose, and instead of allowing them to exist, he learned to extinguish them as soon as they appeared, as if emotions were not something to feel, but something that needed to be controlled, needed to be kept within a safe limit, because just loosening a little, he feared that he would lose control, would become like the person he had spent his entire childhood fearing. Instead of shouting when angry, he stayed silent. Instead of reacting when hurt, he withdrew into himself. Instead of facing conflict, he found ways to avoid it. And over time, these reflexes were no longer choices, but became instincts, became the only way he knew to exist without hurting others. Patrick did not learn to express emotions. He learned to manage them, did not learn to connect, but learned to keep distance. Because in his mind, distance was safety. Distance was the only way to ensure that he would not accidentally hurt someone, that he would not repeat what had happened in that house years ago. But the price of that control was loneliness. A loneliness that was not noisy, not easy to notice, but quietly seeped into the way he lived, the way he communicated, the way he saw the world. Because when you always keep yourself within limits, you also unintentionally prevent others from coming close. And Patrick gradually became a person whom others could respect, could trust, but not easy to understand, not easy to reach. Even when he was very young, he carried within himself a strong awareness of having to control himself, having to always keep everything under control, as if life was something that could become dangerous if not managed carefully, and that made him grow up with a feeling that he always had to hold himself, always had to be vigilant, always had to ensure that no part of himself exceeded the limit, because exceeding the limit meant losing control, and losing control was something he feared more than anything else. Emotions for Patrick were not something to trust, but something that needed to be checked, needed to be restrained. needed to be thought about before allowing it to appear. And over time, he not only controlled negative emotions, but positive emotions were also limited, because he did not clearly distinguish between them. All were things that could lead to loss of control if not managed carefully. That made him become a calm person, a person with a solid appearance. But inside was a system always operating to keep everything at a stable level, a state that was not peace, but a fragile balance between not allowing himself to collapse. And when he stepped into the outside world, met other people, built his first relationships, this way of living continued to follow him, making him always keep a part of himself in the back, always keep a distance enough to feel safe, but also far enough to never really belong to anyone, because deep down, the fear was still there. The fear that if he let himself become too close, too real, too emotional, then one day he might become the very person he had spent his whole life avoiding. And therefore, Patrick Stewart not only grew up, he also built himself into a person defined by control, a person who does not live according to emotions, but lives to ensure that emotions never have the chance to control him. The control did not only shape the way Patrick Stewart perceived the world, but it also shaped the way he existed in it. And when he stepped out from the walls of his childhood to face the larger society, he quickly realized that out there, he was no different from a shadow. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he did not know how to say it, did not know how to allow himself to be seen completely. Because deep down, he still kept the habit of observing more than expressing, listening more than speaking, and that made him become a person that others could overlook without even realizing it, a human being who existed but was not truly present, a voice swallowed back before it could sound. In school, he was not the center of any attention, not the standout one, not the one remembered. Just a quiet boy standing on the sidelines, carrying thoughts that no one heard, emotions that no one saw, and gradually he got used to not being noticed, used to not being the one chosen, used to existing in a world where his voice seemed to have no weight. But then, in a seemingly small moment, he stepped onto the stage. And for the first time in his life, everything changed, not because the world became different, but because he was allowed to become a different person, a person who did not carry fear, was not bound by memories, did not have to suppress every emotion, and right in that role, he felt something he had never had before, the feeling of being listened to, being noticed, being seen, as if the stage lights not only illuminated the character, but also illuminated his own self in a way he had never experienced. Acting was not just a job, it became an escape, a refuge, a way for him to connect with those emotional parts that in real life he always tried to keep hidden. Because when standing on stage, he was no longer the fearful boy in the old house, no longer the man who always had to control himself, but a person allowed to feel, allowed to express, allowed to exist without fear. And that very thing made him cling to the stage like the only thing that gave him a real feeling. When he joined the Royal Shakespeare Company, he stepped into a world where art was placed first, where talent was respected, but it was also a place that was not easy to survive in, because the stage was not a path to quick fame, not a place that brought financial stability, but a long journey that required patience, sacrifice, and an almost absolute belief in what you were pursuing. Patrick lived with the stage, but the stage did not always give him back what he needed. Roles came and went, rounds of applause ended when the curtain closed, and after that was silence, a familiar silence that he had known from very long before, because even though on stage he could become anyone, when he stepped down, he was still himself, still the man trying to find his place in a world that was not always ready to give him a position. Small successes appeared, praises from professionals, roles recognized in the theater community. But all of that was not enough to change his life in a way that he could clearly feel. He still had to struggle with reality, still had to face the feeling that he was doing all the right things, but the results were not commensurate. and it gradually led him to a painful realization that perhaps the world did not really see him, that perhaps his value only existed in the moments when he became someone else, that only when he put on a role, a character, another person, then he was truly noticed, recognized, listened to. And that realization did not bring joy, but carried with it a quiet sadness, because it meant that his true self was still in the background, still hidden, still unseen, as if his life was a series of moments of recognition, but not with his own self, but with the people he embodied. And in that contradiction, Patrick Stewart continued to move forward, continued to act, continued to search for something he could not name, a feeling of being seen not because he was someone else, but because he was himself, something that at that time still seemed very far away. And it was precisely in that feeling of only being seen when becoming someone else that Patrick Stewart entered a long period of his life with no clear highlights, no big turning points, no moment strong enough to change everything. Just days following days, roles following roles, and a feeling of waiting that stretched so long that he almost no longer remembered when he had started waiting. He worked without stopping, appeared on stage, learned lines, rehearsed, performed, received rounds of applause, and then returned to reality, where there were no lights, no widespread recognition, where life continued with very real worries that art could not cover, because the stage could bring meaning, but it did not always bring stability. In those years, money was never something certain. There were periods when he had to live so frugally that every penny had to be calculated carefully, not because he lacked talent, but because the path he chose was not the path leading to quick success, and that kept his life in a fragile state, as if just one wrong step and everything could collapse. Meanwhile, the world around seemed not to stop. People he knew, people he had worked with, began to move further, appearing on television, in films, receiving the attention he was still seeking, and each time, like that, he not only saw their success, but also saw the gap between himself and where he hoped to reach, a gap that kept widening over time. There was no loud jealousy, no complaining, only a quiet but heavy feeling that he was being left behind, that while others moved forward, he still stood still in the same position, still doing the same things, and gradually the question was no longer, when will the opportunity come, but became, will it ever come or not? There were nights, after leaving the stage, he returned alone, sat in the quiet space, and let the thoughts that during the day he tried to push back begin to appear. Questions without clear answers, doubts that he could not share with anyone, because he had gotten used to keeping everything inside, and in those moments, he wondered if everything he was doing was really leading somewhere or not, if there would be a day when he would be seen, recognized, or if he would continue like this, forever on the edge of a world he always tried to step into. His belief did not disappear completely, but it was no longer as solid as before. It became more fragile, easier to be shaken by each disappointment, each opportunity that passed by, each time seeing others achieve what he was still waiting for. And the hardest thing was not clear failure, but the in-between state, where he did not fail completely but also did not succeed, where he was not eliminated but also not chosen. A prolonged gray area that made him not know if he was moving forward or just standing still while time continued to pass. But even so, he did not stop, not because he was always sure he would succeed, but because he did not know what else to do besides continuing. Because acting was not just a career choice, but the only way he knew to exist fully, the only way for him to feel he had meaning, even if only in the brief moments when standing on stage. He continued to learn, continued to act, continued to appear, even when no one really paid attention, even when there was no clear sign that everything would change, because there was one thing that the previous years had taught him, that surviving was sometimes not a victory, but simply not giving up. And so Patrick Stewart continued to walk through the long years of waiting, carrying a belief that was no longer bright, but had not yet gone out. A belief that somewhere ahead, even if very far, there might still be something waiting for him, even if he was no longer sure he had enough time to reach it or not. And then, after all those years of waiting that stretched so long that even he was no longer sure the thing he was waiting for really existed or not, the opportunity finally came to Patrick Stewart, but not in the way people usually imagine about a life-changing moment, with no big bang, no sudden transformation, but just a role, an invitation, a seemingly ordinary step forward, but one that opened a door he had stood in front of for too long without being able to step through. That was the role of Jean-Luc Picard in Star Trek: The Next Generation, a character that initially not everyone believed he was suitable for. A man who had walked through most of his youth in silence, now placed in a position of a leader that the whole world would follow. When the series began airing, everything changed faster than anything he had ever experienced before. His face became familiar. His voice was recognized. The name Patrick Stewart was no longer a name that only existed in the theater world, but became part of pop culture, and for the first time, he was truly seen, not in a small room, not in a theater with a few hundred audience members, but in front of millions of people around the world. But what few people understood was that when success came, it did not bring the relief people usually thought. Because for him, it came too late to be able to change what had been formed before, too late to heal a childhood that had passed, too late to give back the years he had lived in doubt and loneliness. And so, instead of feeling saved, he only felt he was brought into a new position, a position where the world looked at him with admiration, while inside he was still the person shaped by memories that were not easy to erase. Fame grew, recognition came in waves, praises, honors, all created an image that anyone could believe was the destination, the reward for everything he had been through. But the truth was, the wounds did not disappear when the light shone on them. They were not erased by applause, they were only covered by a new shell, a shell of success, of calmness, of a person everyone thought was complete. He began to realize something that not everyone had enough time to understand, that success did not have the ability to turn back time. It could not take him back to change what had happened, could not make the nights full of fear disappear, could not help him become a different child with a different childhood, and also could not teach him things he had never been taught, like how to express emotions naturally, how to build a relationship without carrying the fear of hurting others. From then on, he began to live in two parallel realities. One reality that the world saw, where he was a symbol of control, of intelligence, of mental strength, and another reality where he still had to face what had followed him for so long, where every decision, every relationship, every moment of silence carried traces of the past. There were times when he stood amid the admiration of millions of people, but felt he did not really belong to that image, as if the person they were seeing was a version that had been built, had been trained, had been controlled to a perfect level, while his true self was still in the background, still carrying questions that had never had clear answers. Success brought him a position he had waited for so long, but it also forced him to face a hard-to-accept truth that not everything in life could be fixed, that there were parts of himself that would always be there, not to be erased, but to be carried. And so Patrick Stewart continued to move forward, not like a person who had overcome everything, but like a person who had achieved everything he once wanted, but still had to learn how to live with what he could never change. That success did not only bring Patrick Stewart into the spotlight, but it also placed upon his shoulders an image that gradually even he could not escape from. Because Jean-Luc Picard in Star Trek: The Next Generation was not simply a character, but became a symbol of absolute control, of unshakable reason, of a person who always knew what to do even in the most difficult situations. And when audiences looked at him, they did not only see an actor, They saw a person they could trust, a person they believed would never lose direction, a person they believed always had the answers. That trust was so great that it crossed the boundaries of the screen and entered real life, making Patrick Stewart not only perceived as someone playing Picard, but as Picard himself, as if the qualities of the character were also his true nature, as if the calmness, the certainty, the control he displayed was something natural, something that had always existed inside him from before until now. But behind that image, a different reality still existed, a reality that not everyone saw, where self-doubt had never truly disappeared, where questions about his own value still appeared in moments of silence, where he was not always certain, not always as steady as what the world believed. He began to feel more clearly a gap that was forming, a gap between the person he portrayed and the person he truly was, and that gap was not something that could be easily filled, because it came not only from the difference between acting and real life, but also from the very way he had learned to exist, the way he had learned to control himself to the point that sometimes even he was no longer sure who he was beyond what he showed. There were times when he felt like he was living in a prolonged role, a role with no ending point, where he had to maintain a strong image, had to keep his calmness, had to meet the expectations that others placed on him, and that left him with little space to reveal the weak parts, the imperfect parts, the parts that he had learned to hide from long before the stage lights existed. The trust of the audience, instead of bringing liberation, sometimes became an invisible pressure. Because when everyone believed you were always strong, you no longer had many choices except to continue being strong, even when inside you were not really stable, even when you were still struggling with things no one saw. Patrick Stewart continued to maintain that image, not because he wanted to pretend, but because that was the only way he knew to exist in a world where weakness was not always accepted, where maintaining the image became part of the job, part of the person he had built. But the more he maintained that image, the larger the gap grew between his true self and the person the world saw. And in that gap, he continued to live with a familiar silence, a silence that had begun long before he became a name the whole world knew. A silence not because he had nothing to say, but because he did not know if anyone really wanted to hear his true self or not. And so he continued to walk in two parallel realities, one where he was trusted as a symbol of steadfastness, and one where he was still trying to understand himself, still learning how to live with what was imperfect, still trying to keep everything under control, not to become the person the world expected, but to not lose himself in the process. That silence did not only exist in his inner self, it gradually seeped into Patrick Stewart's personal life in a way that he did not realize right from the beginning, because when his career began to develop strongly, everything around him also changed at a speed he had never experienced before. The work schedule became packed, the filming days stretched long. The continuous trips, the interviews, the public appearances, all pulled him into a rhythm of life that almost had no gaps, and in that whirl, he did what he always did best: focused, disciplined, controlled, completing the work fully, because that was where he felt he had value, where he knew what he had to do, where everything could be arranged in a clear order. But that very focus unintentionally took away things that could not be measured by achievements or recognition, because time for family began to shrink, not because he did not care, but because he did not know how to balance, did not know how to switch from the controlled person at work to a closed person in the family, and gradually the gap began to form, not through big conflicts, but through small voids, absences, moments not shared. His first marriage began to crack in a quiet way, not loud, not dramatic, but deep and hard to mend. Because when two people no longer truly met in emotions, when presence became scarcer, when things that needed to be said were not said, then the gap did not need a big reason to exist. It only needed time, and time was something Patrick no longer had much of to give to his family. His children grew up in a situation where their father was not always there, not always able to listen, not always able to participate in the small but important things in their lives. And although he never intended to become a distant father, reality gradually pushed him into that position, a position he had feared when he was little, a position he had tried to avoid by all means, but in the end still could not completely escape. There was an irony he could not ignore, that while he could play the role of a perfect leader, a person who always knew how to protect, guide, and make the right decisions, in his own life he felt awkward, uncertain, not knowing what to do to keep the family from drifting away, and that feeling was not a clear failure, but a quiet sadness, a realization gradually forming that there were roles in life that could not be learned through scripts, could not be rehearsed like a part, but needed presence, sharing, connection that he had never really learned how to maintain. When the marriage broke down, it did not come as a sudden shock, but like something that had been foreshadowed long ago. An end to the accumulated distances over time, and for Patrick, that was not only the end of a relationship, but also a reflection of himself, a question he could not avoid, about whether he had really done a good job in his role or not, whether he had unintentionally repeated some part of the past he had always tried to avoid or not. The distance from his children was not something he wanted, but it existed, and it carried a feeling he understood very well from when he was small, the feeling of absence, of an important person not really being there when needed. And that made him face a hard-to-accept truth, that although he had tried all his life not to become the person he feared, there were still parts of the past that seeped into the present in more subtle ways, not through violence, but through absence, through distance, through things not said. Success, with everything it brought, could not hold back what had gradually drifted away. It could not replace the lost time, could not fill the gaps that had formed. And Patrick Stewart began to realize that there were things in life that could not be salvaged by effort or discipline, that there were relationships that needed more than physical presence, needed a connection he was still learning to understand. And in that realization, he saw himself not only as a successful person, but also as someone who had lost an important part on the way to that success, a part that no award could compensate for, no role could replace, and no admiration could make it disappear. That realization did not stop at a marriage that had ended. It continued to follow Patrick Stewart into the subsequent relationships, like a loop he could not clearly understand, but also could not escape. Because when he entered the second marriage, he did not bring the carefree nature of a new beginning, but brought everything he had been through, the old gaps, the familiar ways of reacting, and also the things he had never learned about connecting with another person fully. At first, everything seemed different. There was hope. There was a feeling that this time he could do better, could fix what had been wrong. But over time, the old problems began to appear again, not in the same form, but with the same nature: silence when it was needed to speak, withdrawal when it was needed to face, control when it was needed to let go, and gradually the gap formed again, just like it had happened before. What confused him was not that the relationship faced difficulties, but that he did not understand why it kept repeating, why, even though he had tried to change, had tried to be aware, the result was still not much different. And in moments of looking back at himself, he began to realize that the problem did not only lie in the circumstances or others, but lay in the very way he existed in those relationships. He did not lack care, did not lack the desire to bond, but he lacked one thing he had never really learned, which was the way to open up without fear, the way to express emotions without worrying that they would go beyond control, the way to allow others to see his true self without feeling danger. For Patrick, being close to someone was not only physical presence, but also allowing himself to be seen. And that was precisely the hardest thing, because from very early on, he had learned that safety came from keeping a part of himself in the background, that emotions, if not controlled, could lead to hurt. And so even when he wanted to connect, he still kept a distance that even he did not always realize. The second marriage ended not because of lack of effort, but because of things that had never been resolved from within. And when it closed, it brought not only the sadness of a broken relationship, but also a familiar feeling. A feeling of loss that had appeared before, like a repetition he could not avoid. He began to wonder if he really knew how to love or not. Not love in the general sense, but love fully. Love without holding back. Love without fear. And the answer he gradually realized was not something easy to accept, because it forced him to look back at the past, look back at the way he had grown up, look back at what he had learned about emotions and relationships, and realize that there were parts of himself that had never been developed, never been healed, and so they continued to affect the present in ways he could not fully control. The feeling of loss was no longer a single event, but became part of the journey, something he began to accept as a reality. And over time, instead of opening up more, he withdrew again, not because he did not want to love, but because he did not want to continue experiencing the same pain, did not want to continue facing the feeling that he had tried, but it was still not enough. And in that withdrawal, there was a familiar quietness, a quietness he had known since he was small, a quietness that was not peace, but a way to keep everything from becoming worse, a way to exist without having to face things he was still not ready to fully understand. That withdrawal did not bring answers. It only made clearer something Patrick Stewart had felt for a very long time, but had never named. That even though he had come so far, even though he had become a person the whole world looked up to, there was still a part of him that had never left the old house, had never escaped those nights full of noise and fear. And that part was not a distant memory, but something that still existed, still influenced the way he thought, the way he reacted, the way he lived, even when standing on stage, even in front of the camera, even amid rounds of applause. He still carried a quiet vigilance, a habit of always observing, always controlling, always making sure nothing went beyond his reach. Because deep down, he still believed that if he lost control, everything could become dangerous, just like what he had once seen. He did not allow himself to react too strongly, did not allow himself to get angry naturally, did not allow himself to let go of emotions, because each time emotions rose, he not only felt them, but also examined them, as if he had to make sure they were not a sign of something he had always tried to avoid. That control became a part of who he was, no longer a choice but an instinct, a mechanism built from very early on to protect himself and those around him. But at the same time, it also kept him in a state where he was never truly free. There were moments when everything around became quiet, when there were no more roles, no more work, no more voices from outside. Old memories began to surface, not always clearly, but enough for him to feel them, enough to remind him that the past did not disappear. It only retreated to the background and waited for the times when he was no longer busy to return. Images, sounds, feelings that he thought he had left behind sometimes appeared unexpectedly, without reason, without context, just needing a moment of silence. And in those moments he was no longer the man the world saw, but the boy from back then, standing at the end of the hallway, listening, waiting, and not knowing what to do. What he had to face was not that he remembered what had happened, but that he realized they were still there, still intact in some way, and that everything he had built, all the successes, all the roles, was not enough to completely erase what had shaped him from the beginning. He began to understand that he had not truly escaped the past, but had only learned how to live with it, learned how to keep it at a distance, far enough to continue living, but not far enough for it to disappear. The feeling of always having to keep himself within limits was still there, a boundary he did not want to cross, not because he did not want freedom, but because he was not sure what would happen if he let go, if he allowed himself to feel fully without control. And in that realization, there was a truth he could not deny. That fear was not something he had overcome, but something he had learned to carry, a part of who he was, a part of the way he existed, a part of the way he understood the world. There was no moment that marked his complete escape from it, no clear ending point where he could say he had gotten over everything. Only a long journey where he continued to move forward, continued to live, continued to work, while a part of him was still the boy from back then, still carrying fear that no one saw, still trying to keep everything under control, not to become strong, but to ensure that he did not become the person he had spent his whole life trying to avoid. And when he accepted that that fear would not disappear, Patrick Stewart also began to understand that there were wounds that never showed on the surface, with no clear signs, no specific evidence for others to see, but existed deep inside, shaping the way a person thought, reacted, and existed every day. And those were precisely the wounds hardest to carry, because they could not be easily explained, could not be fully shared, and also could not be healed just by time or success. From the outside, he was a stable man, a model of calmness, a person the public trusted, but inside he still had to live with pressures that no one placed on him except himself. The pressure to maintain that image, to keep control, to make sure no part of himself went beyond what the world had become familiar with. Because when you had become a symbol, you no longer lived just for yourself, but lived within the expectations of others. And that left him with little space to be imperfect, to be weak, to reveal the parts he had learned to hide from long ago. He was not someone who easily shared about his personal pain, not because he did not recognize it, but because he was not used to bringing it out, not used to naming the emotions he had spent his whole life trying to control. And so many things remained inside, unspoken, unexplained, existing only as a part of the person he accepted carrying. There was a special kind of loneliness that not everyone could understand, which was when you were widely recognized, when your name was known, when you stood in front of thousands of people and still felt a void that could not be filled, because recognition from the outside did not always correspond to the feeling inside. And for Patrick, there were moments when he realized that everything he had achieved did not change the way he felt about himself, did not reduce the doubts, did not make the memories disappear, did not make him feel complete in the way others might imagine. Success brought him position, respect, and a life he could not have had before. But it did not touch the deepest parts of who he was, the parts that had been formed very early, and were still there, unchanged, not disappearing, only becoming less visible over time. And so he continued to live with a fragile balance, a balance between the person he portrayed and the person he felt, between what the world saw and what he kept for himself. A state that was not a clear contradiction, but the parallel existence of two realities he had become familiar with. He did not stop, did not withdraw, still continued to work, continued to appear, continued to bring the roles that audiences loved. But at the same time, he also continued to carry the things that could not be spoken, the things he did not know if they needed to be spoken or not. Because, after all, he had learned how to live with them, learned how to let them not stop him from moving forward, even though they were still there, like an inseparable part of the journey he had been through. And in that silence, there was a simple but heavy truth, that not every wound needed to be seen to exist, and not every pain needed to be spoken to have influence. There were things that simply stayed, went with you through the years, did not disappear, were not loud, but enough to remind you that the person you became was not only made by what you achieved, but also by what you had to keep for yourself. And then, after many years of living with the things that could not be spoken, Patrick Stewart began to change in a way that was not loud, but had deep meaning. Not a sudden turning point, but a slow process where he gradually decided that he could not continue living by keeping everything inside, that the silence that once helped him survive was no longer the only way to move forward. And for the first time in many years, he began to talk about what had happened in his past, not like a story to tell, but like a part of the person he no longer wanted to hide. He mentioned the nights full of fear, the mother he could not protect, the feeling of helplessness that had followed him throughout his childhood, and speaking those things out did not make them disappear, but it changed the way he faced them. Because when the memories were put into words, they were no longer shapeless shadows, but became things that could be acknowledged, understood, and placed in their right position in his life. Not stopping at sharing, he began to participate in activities to protect people who had gone through similar things, using his own story to speak out about domestic violence, not as an outsider, but as someone who had once been inside, who had once been the child standing still in the hallway, who had once felt fear without knowing what to do. And that experience made his words carry a different weight, not theory, but reality. When he stood in front of the public and talked about what he had been through, it was not weakness, but another form of strength, a strength that came from acceptance, from no longer trying to hide the imperfect parts, from allowing himself to be seen more fully. Looking back at his childhood, he no longer only saw fear and helplessness, but began to understand that what had happened, though painful, had contributed to creating the person he became, not to justify, not to erase responsibility, but to realize that the past was not only something to avoid, but also something to be understood, so he could continue living without being completely controlled by it. He no longer looked at the child from back then only with pity, but with a deeper compassion, an acknowledgement that that boy had done everything he could in his circumstances, that the silence, the suppression, the control were not weaknesses, but the way he had found to survive. And in that realization there was an important change. He no longer tried to separate himself from the past, no longer saw it as something that needed to be completely overcome, but began to accept that it was a part of him, a part that could not be erased, but also no longer needed to be hidden. The memories that once frightened him did not disappear, but they no longer held the same power as before, because he no longer ran away from them, no longer tried to keep them at a safe distance at all costs, but allowed them to exist as what had happened, no more, no less. That did not mean he had completely healed, did not mean he was no longer affected, but simply that he no longer let those memories define his entire self, no longer let them decide how he saw the world or how he saw himself. And in that change, there was a form of freedom he had never experienced before, not freedom from the past, but freedom in the way he existed with it, a freedom that did not come from forgetting, but from acceptance, a quiet step forward, but enough to change the way he continued his life, no longer like a person trying to run away, but like a person who had stopped, looked straight at what had once frightened him, and decided that he would no longer turn his back on it. That acceptance of not running away from his past anymore led Patrick Stewart into another phase of his life. Not a sudden change, but a slow opening up that he had never truly allowed before, and it was during that period that he met Sunny Ozell, who later became his wife. A relationship that began not with perfection, not with a person free of wounds, but with a person who had gone through many losses, many failures, and had begun to understand himself more clearly. This marriage was not like what he had experienced before, not because the circumstances were completely different, but because he was different, because this time he did not enter the relationship with the desire to control or keep everything within a safe limit, but with an acceptance that there were things that could not be controlled. That connecting with another person required more than discipline, it required presence, listening, and sometimes accepting uncertainty. He learned how to build a relationship not based on keeping distance, but based on allowing that distance to gradually narrow, not in a perfect way, not always easy, but enough to create a stability he had never truly felt before. Sunny Ozell was not only a life partner, but a companion, a person who accepted him with everything he carried, not only the success but also the unfinished parts, and that created a sense of peace he had not found in the previous phases of his life. Affection came to him no longer with the color of haste or the expectation of fixing the past, but with a different, deeper meaning, because it came after he had lost many things, after he had gone through unfulfilled relationships, after he had understood that loving was not something natural for him, but something that needed to be learned, needed to be practiced, and needed to be built over time. Besides that, his friendship with Ian McKellen became an important part of his life, a relationship not bound by complicated expectations, not needing to prove anything, just simply the bond between two people who had gone through many years, understood what each other had experienced, and could be there for each other without needing to hide or control too much. In that relationship, Patrick found a different form of connection, a form of connection not based on roles or responsibilities, but based on mutual understanding and respect, something he had been searching for in one way or another throughout his life. The age difference between him and Sunny Ozell was not something he avoided, but something he accepted as part of reality. And in that acceptance, he no longer tried to make everything ideal, no longer searched for a perfect model, but only focused on what truly existed. The ordinary moments, the simple conversations, the things he might have overlooked before because he was too focused on maintaining control. Love that came late did not bring naivety but brought clarity, did not bring perfection but brought sincerity. And for Patrick Stewart, that did not make it less valuable, but on the contrary made it more important, because it was not something he obtained easily, but something he had to go through so much to understand and appreciate. And in this phase of his life, he no longer searched for a perfection he knew he could not achieve, but searched for a stability enough to feel he no longer had to stand alone, a presence enough so he did not need to keep everything inside, a form of peace that did not erase the past but allowed him to live with it in a gentler way. And when he reached the age of 86, after everything he had been through, Patrick Stewart no longer lived in the state of having to run away like before, no longer tried to keep everything in the background or hide the parts he once saw as weak, because at some point, a person no longer had enough energy to continue fighting their own past, and instead they began to learn how to stand still and look back, not to change anything but to understand more clearly what had made them who they were. At an age when many people chose to stop, he did not stop in the sense of giving up, but stopped in the sense of accepting that his journey was not a perfect straight line, but a series of steps that included both success and loss, moments of admiration and periods when no one saw, and both of those things held equal value in shaping who he was. He no longer tried to become the model others expected, no longer felt the need to maintain a perfect image, because he understood that perfection had never been the real goal, and that the imperfect parts were precisely what made his life real. When looking back, he did not only see the roles, the awards, the achievements the world could easily recognize, but also the years of silence, the unfulfilled relationships, the times he did not know what to do, and instead of avoiding them, he accepted all of it as an inseparable part of himself. There were things he could not change, could not go back to do differently, could not fix in the way he might have wanted when he was young. And in that acceptance there was no loud regret but only a calmness that came from understanding that life was not a place where everything could always be redone. He began to focus on what remained, not in the sense of narrowing down, but in the sense of selecting, choosing the things that were truly important, the people who truly mattered, the moments that did not need to prove anything, and that brought him a different kind of peace. Not the peace of a life without problems, but the peace of a person who understood himself well enough not to be completely controlled by those problems anymore. He no longer looked at the past as something that needed to be overcome, but as a part of the story he had lived. A story that was not perfect, but true. And that truth was precisely what he held on to when everything else gradually became less important. In these years, he no longer needed to prove who he was, no longer needed to seek recognition in the way he once did. because he had gone through enough to understand that a person's value did not lie in how they were seen, but in how they could live with themselves. And so Patrick Stewart lived with a calmness that did not come from everything becoming easy, but from having gone far enough that he no longer needed to run, no longer needed to hide from what had once frightened him, but could stand still, look at it, and continue moving forward without being held back by it like before. And when looking back at the entire journey, from the small, noisy house to the big stages where the whole world knew him, Patrick Stewart did not see a simple story of success, but saw a chain of moments connected by endurance, by the ability to keep moving forward even when there was no guarantee that things would get better. And in that flow, the image of the boy from back then was still there, not disappearing, not replaced, but existing as an inseparable part of who he was. The boy standing at the end of the hallway, listening to sounds he could not control, feeling fear he could not share, and knowing he could not do anything to change what was happening. That was the starting point of everything. Not a memory left behind, but a foundation on which everything afterward was built. And when compared to the person he became, the difference did not lie in having erased the past, but in having learned not to let it define all of him. He did not become completely free from the wounds. There was no moment when he could say he had fully healed, because there were things that did not disappear with time. They only changed the way they existed, from clear fears to more subtle reflexes, from specific memories to feelings hard to name, and in all of that, he did not try to deny or erase them, but accepted that they were a part of the story he carried. But what made that story different was not what he had gone through, but the way he continued afterward. Because instead of letting what had happened hold him back, he chose to keep going, chose to work, chose to create roles, values, contributions that not everyone could make. And in that process, he did not only exist for himself, but also began to speak out for people who had once been in his position, people who had once felt helpless, once lived in silence, once thought their story was not worth hearing. When he talked about domestic violence, when he shared what he had been through, he did not do it to seek sympathy, but to open a space where similar stories could be acknowledged, where others no longer felt they had to keep everything inside like he once did. And in that role, he was no longer the helpless boy from back then, but a person who could make a difference, not by changing the past, but by changing the way it was understood in the present. His life was not perfect, not a journey where everything was resolved, not a story where every wound was healed, but it was a life that was not defeated, a life where difficulties did not make him stop, but only became part of the path he continued to walk. And perhaps the most remarkable thing was not what he had achieved, but the fact that he was still here, still continuing, still present, not as a flawless symbol, but as a person who had gone through enough to understand that strength was not about being unharmed, but about the ability to live with those wounds without letting them decide the ending. When the story closed, there was no clear victory, no perfect ending, only a simple but profound truth, that Patrick Stewart never truly escaped the pain that had followed him from the beginning, but he also did not let it win. And in the space between those two things he had lived, had created meaning, and had become a person whose value did not lie in how perfect he was, but in the fact that he had not stopped, even when everything inside said he could. The story of Patrick Stewart is not a journey of victory in the usual sense, but a quietly enduring journey that makes people feel both heartbroken and respectful, because right from the early parts, the image of the boy standing still at the end of the hallway, listening to the shouting and helplessly watching his mother being hurt, became a haunting detail, not only because of the pain, but also because of the helplessness that followed him throughout his life, and that very helplessness turned into a deep fear that he might become his own father, a fear that made him suppress emotions, keep distance in relationships, and eventually led to the broken marriages as we saw in the middle of the story, where he achieved brilliant success with Star Trek, but lost connection with his family. a contrast that makes viewers realize success does not always come with happiness. What makes this story especially heartbreaking does not lie in the big events, but in the small but repeating details, like how he always stayed silent when he needed to speak, always withdrew when he needed to face things, and always kept himself within a limit that even he could not break. And even when he reached the age of 86, he did not declare that he had healed, but only acknowledged that he had learned how to live with those wounds, something that reflects a very relatable truth in American life, where many people grow up in difficult circumstances, but not everyone has the opportunity or ability to face it straightforwardly. The lesson here is not to become perfect or to overcome everything, but to keep living, to keep moving forward, and if possible, to speak out like the way Patrick Stewart did when he shared about domestic violence, because in a society that values strength like the United States, admitting pain is not weakness, but a rare form of courage. And that is precisely the greatest legacy he left, not only the roles, but a way of living honestly with oneself, no matter how heavy the past is. If this story makes you look back at the things you have kept in silence, please hit subscribe and stay with us, because there are still many journeys like this waiting to be told. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video, where we continue to explore people who did not collapse even while carrying a heavy past.